So hello, everyone. I know a lot of you know me because you're in my children's literature class, which is why you're here, but I'm Dr. Amy Ross-Kilroy. If you don't know me, and thanks everybody for showing up so promptly. I'm really excited about today's discussion. Professor Teresa DeVrum is here with us already in the room, and we're shortly going to watch a video recording of a discussion and lecture between Professor DeVrum and Logan Metz. Did I mess up his Metz? Sorry. But you guys, as you know, my students primarily read the Beauty and the Beast text, which is similar but very different to the Beauty and the Beast film, especially the ending where some very interesting things are done. This is from our end, this is the week where we've moved a little bit more away from looking at realistic children's fiction to looking at fantasy and fairy tales in children's fiction. It's actually a really nice intersection for us because last week we finished up a play called Dragon Wings by Lawrence Yep, which is about a child who immigrates from China in the early 1900s to San Francisco. But there's also the presence of some sort of supernatural elements in the form of the Dragon King. And so we already began a little bit our discussion of monsters by comparing the Dragon King in Yep's narrative in the way that the Chinese characters think about dragons versus the way that the character Miss Whitlaw, who is of British descent, thinks about dragons and has a stained glass of St. George in the dragon in the background of her house. It's very valuable to her. So we've already started thinking a little bit about monsters in terms of cultural encounter, in terms of the way that monsters are created and the roles that they serve. So I'm really excited again for today's discussion and continuing that line of thought.
Amy, can I ask you a question? Have your students seen the movie?
The students should have all watched the movie. It was assigned for homework, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're ready just to play the video, and it's about, I don't know, 50 minutes long, and then we'll stop, and then we'll, maybe you'll all put your cameras on because I can't see your beautiful faces, and we'll fend off questions as best we can. All right?
Good.
Hi, I'm Teresa DeVrum, and I'm a professor of English and director of the Marymount Institute for Faith, Culture, and the Arts. And we're here together. I'm here together with Logan Metz. He's going to introduce himself, but he is an LMU alum, among other things. Go ahead, Logan.
Hi, yes, I'm Logan Metz. I am an LMU alum, among other things. Graduated in 2010. Worked with Teresa on all sorts of projects and books and talks and things like that, and eventually became a musician after a long road of choosing between music and academia. I am now on the road as a musician, coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts today.
Tell us the name of your band that you're playing with right now, also
right.
with sort of LMU alum.
Actually, yeah. I am playing with a fella named Lucas Nelson, who I met at LMU, and so and the band name is Lucas Nelson and Promise of the Real. We're in the middle of a huge tour, actually smack dab in the middle. Halfway point was yesterday, I think. So I am, you know, I got a foot in both worlds right now, but happy to be doing this. It's always fun to get back into my literary world. So. In the Shakespeare world.
Yeah, so some of you in my Shakespeare class are gonna do creative projects, and I got the idea for that simply because I used to always just have papers and so forth, and my phone is ringing. I'm sorry, is because Logan did such a spectacular creative project where he wrote a suite for the class and explained what he was doing, and then that turned into a lifelong, so far, as long as we've known each other, collaboration on all kinds of projects. So when we were first thinking about this, so there's two classes here. So there's a Shakespeare class, which I knew was just mine, and then Amy Ross-Kilroy's class, and Amy's going to come on when we do her class, which is a class in liberal studies. And people going out to teaching. So Logan and I both done a lot of teaching, and so we can sort of talk to that as well. But when we first thought of this, there's all kinds of ways to frame what a monster is and how a monster comes into being. And there are many ways to go. And as you probably know, the word monster means that thing, whatever that is, the boogeyman creature, but it also means to show. And then we started talking about this a little bit more. And as an introduction, I want you to think about, and you don't have to have read all these books or know all these books because, but all of you have seen Beauty and the Beast, and my group has read Othello. So that's fine. But there are these outsiders in lots of places that, and in real life, that I think become monsters because we let them become monsters, or we make them monsters. And so what we're going to focus on is the way in which Iago and the Bet, or the beast in Beauty and the Beast, are made monsters and unmade monsters, both sides of the story. So if you know the great old Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, you know that there's a character called Grendel, and the reason he wants to eat up all the other guys that are fighting and being together is because he's excluded. He's excluded from the mead hall. He can't be part of the fraternity of young soldiers. Okay. If you know about Satan from Milton's Paradise Lost, right? He excludes himself at some level, but he can't be a god. He can't be with the gods. He has to be something else. If you've read Wuthering Heights or seen a movie of Wuthering Heights, by a Bronte novel, one of the Brontes, you know that Heathcliff, who is kind of a good guy, but he's poor. And when he grows up, he takes his revenge on the rich people because he's excluded from them. He looks through as a little boy through a glass and sees them all partying and happy and eating while he lives with pigs. We were talking about Darth Vader in Star Wars. Again, somebody who's, wears a mask, is excluded and therefore becomes evil. Okay. And somehow, so that society lets him become evil. And, even Logan and I talked this morning about the Joker and the Batman. Do you want to say something about that character? Because you said something so interesting.
Sure. Yeah. There's carrying on with this idea that monsters are made. They don't come out of nowhere. They're made, and they're made by us in a lot of ways, which we'll talk about. I think a couple of ways in which that's true, including societal exclusion, like Tracy is talking about, and also the kind of projection that comes with that. So this creation of an other that we are able to fear. And another great example of that, as Tracy pointed out, is the Joker. And one aspect of this that I think is really interesting, which includes Grendel from Beowulf, who later got his own novel by John Gardner, who tells the story from a sympathetic point of view from the monster in Beowulf, Grendel. Same with Milton's Satan, where this is the bad guy, quote unquote, but also in Paradise Lost, the most interesting by far, and maybe the most likable character in the poem. And same can be said for the Joker in the Christopher Nolan version with Heath Ledger, and in the Joaquin Phoenix version. After both of those movies came out, for Halloween, there were far more Jokers than there were Batmans on the streets. There's something that people see of themselves in these outcasts and these bad guys and the villains, or the monsters. And part of, I think, the thesis of what this talk is going to be about is that it is because we create them that we, if not sympathize, at least see ourselves in them, whether it is something that we despise about ourselves, project onto another, or something that is created by that kind of societal exclusion.
Since we're coming up on Halloween, really, as this conference, we kind of said it right before Halloween, this symposium, it is interesting that, so often people's mothers will dress up like a witch because that's what their kids think of them some of the times. And little kids will dress up as things they're really scared of, right? Like Dracula and the Joker and things like that they don't really have truck with, but they make themselves into what they're afraid of, or we make other people into what we're afraid of.
Very much so. Yeah. And I think one other example that I'll just foreshadow what's to come is not only in characters, but in humans in real life, that we'll be talking a little bit about Charles Manson later as kind of an archetypical villain or monster from real life. But he's known as this like cult leader guy, but really he was a wormy little man with a terrible childhood who spent the first half of his first 30 years of his life in jail and read the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. So we can see the kind of evil twin version of wanting to have friends as developing a cult family and committing these horrible acts of what he perceived to be vengeance. But that's going to tie into Othello later.
And so I would say that the poster child here for if the literary one might be, and it's going to come up in other people's talks in the symposium, is the character of Frankenstein, which is a patchwork human being created, and that, by a doctor who's trying to reinvent, play God really, to make a new man. And what he ends up doing is making a monster, and a monster who is defined because he can't be part of mankind. He wants to fall in love. He wants to have friends. He wants to have what we all want, right? And then when he can't have it, he becomes vengeful. And wouldn't perhaps we all? And that's the question we're playing with. I just wanted to sort of put the two bookends of what we were looking at here. So Othello, which I don't think maybe the liberal studies students have read, and that's totally fine because we'll outline a little bit of it. And then the Beauty and the Beast. And if you look at these two things next to each other, okay, you could see, and I think Logan's going to talk more about this, but that one is a revision of another. And if you look at Othello, for me at least, Othello is one of the greatest characters and heroic figures in all of anything Shakespeare wrote. And yet he is destroyed bit by bit by bit, taken apart by one small, smarmy white man. Remember, those of you who don't know, Othello is Black. He's perhaps a Moorish convert. He was a slave. And he rises to become this very powerful general in the Venetian army, where he then falls in love with a young, beautiful white girl. And she is a girl. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. She's very young. And he's older, maybe in his 40s, friend of her father's, which also comes into the plot of Beauty and the Beast. Mm-hmm. And what you watch is a kind of slide. I mean, I sort of see it as a triangle, like sliding down. He's big to start off with. He's eloquent. He's noble. He's extraordinary. And this one thing, this person, Iago, who's a Manson character, rips him to shreds and destroys him and makes him turn in on himself. So he becomes a stereotype, racist stereotype of a Black man and stereotype of a villain, or he's turned into it. And so that is a play I just mentioned today to my class, Shrouded in Darkness. It begins at night, it ends at night, and it's about what we cannot see. And one of the things we can't see, perhaps I read this as it has racial dynamics, but certainly what is evil? How is evil constructed? And you could see Beauty and the Beast, okay, the film you watched and the old film, right, the Cocteau film, as the opposite. It begins with this sort of young, virginal, perfect little Cinderella story with these evil sisters, and there's money problems, and the house gets repossessed. No mothers in either story. The mother is absent in the Beauty and the Beast story. And so Beauty serves as the mother figure in the household. She's the person who cleans, who organizes, and who takes care of dad, same as Desdemona and Othello. And as she is then, through the sins of her father, which are not really sins, but he plucks a rose, and that has all kinds of symbolic meaning, which we can get into at some point, about virginity and all kinds of other things. But anyway, he desecrates the beast's property, and it is a rose in this case, a symbol of love, of female sexuality, perhaps. And then she has to pay the price, which is to hold her father's life, so that he won't be killed if she ransoms him. And so you see the inverse of this in Beauty and the Beast, where Beauty comes and she's repulsed by the beast. Okay, read Othello, the character of Othello, perhaps a young 15-year-old Venetian blonde white woman might be repulsed by this 40-year-old Black man, but instead falls in love with the beast. And so the problem here is, one is about, hatred creating the villain making the good man into a villain himself, perhaps, and probably so. And what converts that in the Beauty and the Beast story is love. Okay. And there's so many parallels when you're looking through that story. I mean, both creatures, Othello and the Beast, are exotic. The Beast in the movie you saw, which is in black and white, even looks like he has some features that you might think he's certainly not a French person. And so he may be, and this was done a long time ago, 1946, something of a Black man underneath that, because he's dark skinned, right, and everybody else is white, and you get all these sort of things that come together. And Logan's going to talk about this more, but Desdemona, not to give it away, the female lead in Othello is murdered in her bed. The first time we see the beauty in the beast's castle, which is this sort of magical transformation, she's lying in bed. So she goes from the bed that Desdemona is murdered in a way to become the wife. So a completely inverse trajectory of the two. And it's one of the reasons we sort of chose that movie to go with Othello. And just one last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Logan. You see, this one key, so Shakespeare and most filmmakers that know what they're really doing, they're looking often in dramatists at a thing. Okay, and so in Beauty and the Beast, there's a mirror, there's a magic horse, there's a magic glove, there's a key. And the key is all the virility and the power and the magic of that kingdom, this life, this castle that's made out of hands and faces, and everything moves. There's no servants, but everything moves by magic. And that key is, let's just say, the key to the beast's heart. And in Othello, that key is a handkerchief. And the handkerchief is also the key to Othello's virility in some ways, the key to his faithfulness and her faithfulness. And in the case of Othello, that object is a lie, is a deceit. And in the case of Beauty and the Beast, the object is stolen. So in both, there's something parallel, but the outcome is quite different. One of them is, for lack of better words, tragic, and the other one is comic. One ends in the happy couple floating off into the air, and I know it's a little cheesy there at the end, but that's what it is. And the other ends is the man strangling his wife in his bed, in her bed. Okay, and there's a key element. So watch that little bit. And just one last little thing I'll say is that Othello's Desdemona, when they first say to her, "Why did you marry this older black man, not like you at all?" And she says, "I saw Othello's visage in my mind. I saw his face," meaning what he looks like, his color, in her mind. Now, whatever that means, we can talk about, but she envisioned him. She envisioned him. And what does Beauty see in the mirror? When the beast is dying, she first looks in the mirror, and you've all seen this thing, and as she looks in, she sees her reflection. When her sisters only see monkeys and ugly old ladies in the mirror, she sees her reflection, and her reflection turns into the reflection of the dying beast. Okay, so this what begins as love in Othello turns into love in Beauty and the Beast. And again, think about the mirror image. Okay, here's this little thin piece of glass with silver on the back, or mercury in the olden days, that reflects back at us who we are, but also who we imagine we are, who we imagine someone else is, who the other is. Okay, so with that, Logan's going to take over.
Sure. I'll start with the mirror thing, just to add a little bit to that, which is, when you look in the mirror, of course, you are not seeing yourself as you are seeing the exact inverse image of what you are. So there's a lot of that going on too, including reflection and projection in Othello. So first, just to reiterate the idea of this Beauty and the Beast fairy tale story versus the inverted plot of that in Othello. Long story short and very, I guess, truncated, is that woman is at first repulsed by the beast. When we see when the beast first proposes marriage to La Belle in the movie, all we get is a scream. The reaction is completely non-verbal or I guess non-linguistic, but she screams, and then of course at the end it's a long path of getting to love the beast. There's a lot of sexual charged imagery as well with these objects that Teresia mentioned, the key, obviously the key lock imagery, and the handkerchief in Othello. In a lot of Shakespearean tragedies and comedies, there is an enormous weight placed on the transaction of a single object, which should be here but is there. Or take Romeo and Juliet is a good example, where the whole thing could have been avoided if one person had delivered a letter on time. A missing letter made the tragedy happen. In Comedy of Errors, the whole mistaken identity involves a chain and I think a cup or something. There are a lot of different objects that are moving around. It's a farce, and only does it get resolved, excuse me, when all of those objects have returned to their proper place. So in Othello, that object is a handkerchief, which Othello has given to Desdemona, and it is a white handkerchief spotted, which has embroidered strawberries on it. So it is a red spotted white sheet, which is also very kind of graphically a sexual metaphor for the virginity of a woman and the wedding sheets, as Theresia will tell you that the sign of blood on wedding sheets was a representation of the bride's virginity during marriage. So the reverse Beauty and the Beast plot involves in Othello, rather than a woman at first being repulsed and then being in love, it is a woman at first in love with what her father said, what she at first feared to look at, to love what she feared to look at, meaning Othello, and then turns into this horror, and the climax of both involve the union of the Beauty and the Beast in the wedding bed. In Othello, of course, it is the horrible murder, which, by the way, is murder by smothering, and it is visually a very sexually charged image to have a man on top of a woman in the bed murdering. So it's this kind of primal scene of racism at the end of Othello, but it gets there through, it's kind of a dual monster story, because Othello, if we're calling him the monster, that is what he becomes. But he doesn't start out that way. As Tracy pointed out, he starts off the most eloquent character in the text by far, the most noble, the most, the one who has overcome the worst odds and the most trials. He's, the kind of ideal man in the beginning of the show. And he's the ideal man according to everybody. Nobody even seems to think about the fact that he's black, or the fact that he's a Moor, or the fact that he's older. It's all fine until the real monster of the story, Iago, starts to work his magic. So whole kind of basic premise is that reverse Beauty and the Beast plot. The other area I want to get into is the control that Iago has over the script and over the action in the play. When we first hear about Othello, we hear it from Iago. The play opens with Iago in the darkness in the windy streets of Venice, and he's talking about feeling ripped off of a promotion he thought he was entitled to that went to another guy. And this is apparently the source of Iago's jealousy, although that's a big complicated thing because it doesn't seem quite right later on in the show or in the text either. But the first description we get of Othello is from Iago, and it is relentlessly bestial language. Iago goes with his little henchman Rodrigo, goes beneath the Desdemona's father's house, Brabantio, and says, "Hey, your daughter's run off and gotten married to Othello." But he doesn't say Othello. He says, "An old black ram right now is tupping your white ewe." So he opens what we hear of Othello with pretty graphic bestiality imagery. And he goes on and on. He says, "You're let me get the quote here. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire out of you." He goes on to say, "You'll have your daughter covered with a Barbary horse, a black horse." And this goes on and on and on and on. And worse, I mean, slurs, and he throws up all of this racist rhetoric in the air. And some scholars even argued that he kind of invents racism on the spot, because of the idea of it is almost anachronistic for when the play was written, but also nobody, including Desdemona's father, who Theresia pointed out was one of Othello's great friends, nobody seems to have noticed that he was black or thought that it would be a problem until Iago mentions this and throws all of this dirt in the air. When we see Othello finally, after this whole exchange, he is the exact opposite of what we as an audience are led to believe. We get the rumor and we get the slander first, and then we see Othello in direct opposition to what Iago has described him as. How am I doing, Tracy? You want to jump in here at any point?
No, and I just would say, the actual slave trade starts in 1610, I think. But Shakespeare, I mean, was so amazing as he saw it coming. And when we're looking at Beauty and the Beast, is a kind of imitation of this, even if it's not racially charged in the same way, it is actually. But he saw it coming, and I think, if you think of the racist terms to describe Black men, and many of them are bestial. And so that's already in the air. And Shakespeare, it's like he kind of saw it. There's probably hardly any Black men in England at the time Shakespeare is writing, but he had an imagination about it. And that is why it's very important we look at this play. We just finished in our class, Titus Andronicus, with Aaron the Moor, but Aaron's quite a different character. And just to see this, that nobody even notices he's Black. I mean, it's just, that's it. And so that's sort of interesting that those things just get invented. And again, so Iago is the epitome of a kind of evil, which I will just only for now call racism, which can't really be nailed down, but does color whatever you hear that goes forward. And I sometimes say to classes, if you heard me in the grocery store using the N-word, for example, or even in class, you would not think very highly of me. And so, to say the least. And so that word alone is poison. And that once those poison gets put in the ear, which is what Logan's going to talk about, because he wrote a whole treatment of Othello, a kind of a modern version of this. What does it mean to be poisoned through the ear? And this is going to be important in Hamlet as well, but to say something. And, and again, if I just said, well, actually Logan's a drug dealer, he's not a musician. Well, all I have to do is say it. That's not true, but I say it, and you might think, well, maybe, he is in a rock band. I mean, what, So once you do something like that, once you say something like that, then what happens to it? And what happens to a text when it goes free floating somehow? Go ahead, Logan.
And it becomes contagious as well. We see Iago's, the initial kind of racist eruption that he has in the first act. We see it echoed by Desdemona's father when Desdemona's father drags Othello in front of the entire Senate of Venice, who are very busy dealing with this whole invasion of the Turks. But they say, stop the presses. We have a more important thing to talk about. This man is sleeping with my daughter. And Brabantio suddenly echoes many of Iago's racist, slanderous remarks. And this is apparently throughout the whole history of Othello and Brabantio's relationship, which happens before the text begins, again, never really an issue. So there's this contagiousness or this toxicity maybe of the language, to carry on with the poison metaphor, that carries through the text as well, where
and just to bring it back to Beauty and the Beast just for one little second, which is that the beast has no name but the beast. He's La Bête. Right. And this is very interesting. Like, you might have a nickname like, the Hulk or the Rock or something like that, right, as a performer. But the Beast, I mean, like, what's his real name? And of course, at the end, he inhabits the body of the guy she actually wants to love, which I'll say something about when we finally end. But, he doesn't have another name, whereas Othello has this name, but then he certainly starts to become the Beast, literally. I mean, he gets the Beast over and over again.
And that is, I think, one of the, pretty accepted readings of Othello from the perspective of kind of modern race conversations, is that Othello begins slowly and very painfully to internalize all of the racist stereotypes that had been thrown at him and that he was in direct opposition of in the beginning of the text. Slowly he comes to internalize them and carry them out in a way that suggests that this is Iago's kind of twisted fantasy, that he is Iago projecting his own, I'll say, blackness or darkness in the other sense of it into Othello's literal blackness, or his pigmentary blackness, and Othello internalizes it, becomes everything he started off in opposition to, namely he becomes Iago's monstrousness. There's this great article. Go ahead.
No, and just to say that many of you will become teachers, and again, there've been so many studies about this. And it's been my experience in life. But if you tell someone something long enough, don't they become that? So if your boyfriend, you could not be very attractive, says you're a goddess and you're beautiful and you're this, then maybe it doesn't matter if you are or not. That's what you are. Or if someone says you're stupid long enough, or says blonde girls are just pretty, but they lose their looks quickly, and they're all stupid, or it doesn't matter what you say about any group of people, or that a Black person or a Latino person or this person or Chinese person, they're all like this. You say it long enough, everyone starts to believe that, as opposed to the individual reality of whether someone's a good person or not, or whether they're interesting or they're good. And this, I think it's interesting to think about this negatively and positively, because I've certainly had a child where I watched a lot of parents around me say that their child was brilliant. Well, you know what? There's one brilliant child in about 8 gazillion kids. And what does it mean to tell the good thing too? And this is something to really think about if you're going to teach, because at what point is praise true and what point is it not true? What point does it encourage someone to grow? What point is it dangerous to tell someone that you could be a ballet dancer when it's not going to happen, probably. So where is it, and so again, being told over and over again something, and then if you do it long enough, then as Hitler said, if you lie long enough, you believe the lie yourself too. Go ahead, Logan.
Sure. Yeah. So I've got this article by Janet Edelman that has a really great, in the beginning of it, has just a really great kind of classic summary of the Othello race issue and the Iago, projecting all of Iago's own evil into Othello's blackness. And it's summed up here where she says, we are made to understand Othello not as the natural embodiment of Iago's, quote, old black ram gone insanely jealous. That's like surface plot reading, but as the victim of a racist ideology everywhere visible in Venice, an ideology to which he is relentlessly subjected, as Tracy is talking about, and which increasingly comes to define him as he internalizes it so fully that later, when he's searching for a metaphor to convey his sense of the corruption soil attached to both his name and Desdemona's body, Othello can come up with no term of comparison other than his own face. So this is a callback to what initially made Desdemona fall in love with him, which is she saw Othello's visage or face in his mind. Othello later, once he's been poisoned by Iago's slander, says, my name that was as fresh as Diane's visage, same word, is now begrimed and black as mine own face. So he is left with only his own blackness to define himself by the end of it.
And by the end, black is bad.
Right, and this is Iago's master plan, I think, is to make black bad, if it can be summed up that succinctly. Throughout the play, Iago controls the narrative, and he controls the actions of the other characters in the text to such an extent that he makes his lie true himself. And this brings us back to kind of the initial idea of monsters being made and monsters being created by us. A lot of critics read Iago as kind of an intertextual playwright, like the play wants to go one direction. By the end of Act 2, Othello and Desdemona are happily married. They arrive at Cyprus, they seal it with a kiss, and it is a Shakespearean comedy wrapped up beautifully by the end of Act 2. Right at that point, Iago says in musical terms, oh, you are well tuned now, but I'll set down the pegs, meaning I'll twist down the tuning pegs. I'll set down the pegs that, oh gosh, I lost it, that make this music, or something like that. He uses musical terminology to say, okay, comedy's over. Now I am going to turn this play into a tragedy. So this also brings up where kind of I want to take the creating a monster metaphor is the artist as a monster maker. If Iago is kind of a playwright within the play, then he makes a monster out of Othello. But at the same time, we have this idea that Shakespeare himself wrote Iago as this monster that, like Milton's Satan, maybe like Shelley's Frankenstein, maybe like Christopher Nolan's Joker, begin as a character, but then take on a life of their own and become almost their own autonomous entity. Harold Bloom talks about this with the comic side of Falstaff and the tragic side with Hamlet, where Shakespeare seems to have written a character that is beyond his own intellect and kind of develops a life of his own. So I feel like there is something on a kind of meta-textual level about making art that is like making monsters, including in the realm of adaptation. If we think about Frankenstein being cobbled together by bits and pieces of other human beings, a lot of these bits and pieces of archetypes or of story plots, if you want to go the kind of Joseph Campbell Jung route, there are common ingredients that are cobbled together to make different art out of old art. And that kind of reanimation or revivification, to use like the Frankenstein metaphor, there are no monsters until they are written, until they are created by, in this case, and in all of these cases that we're talking about, artists themselves, poets, playwrights, and filmmakers.
Those of you who are going to teach children, what do we raise our, now a lot of fairy tales unfortunately have been sanitized, but these are all, from Goldilocks all the way around, these are scary stories. And what gets written down, I mean, a child may naturally be afraid of the dark or of this, but the stories encourage the fear, and they encourage a child to grow up or to know their fears. If you read your Bettelheim, which some of you may have read, who's the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood? Who's the evil witch in Snow White? I mean, who are these people? These are other versions of mothers and grandmothers and God knows what else. And that we write them and that we make them a way to come in and out of this evil, right? That they're cathartic. And I think then Logan's going to talk about teaching an ekphrasis, which is a very big word. Maybe you'll explain it to us, because this is what he essentially did with translating, and it really is translating Othello into, and it's what the Beauty and the Beast film does. It translates, in my opinion, Othello into something completely different. That's now a completely washed out version in Disney and stuff beyond, where the stuff is talking and everything's working, and it's very different. And remember, Beauty and the Beast is a tragedy to begin with. It's the opposite of what Logan just said about Othello. Right? The guy's getting his furniture dispossessed. His son's a drunk and a gambler. His daughters are mean little nasty creatures. And then it takes off because she saves the day. So this inversion, and also two places, Cyprus, Venice, wherever they are in France, to the Beast's magic castle. So very similar kinds of building blocks for creativity that begin in childhood already. I mean, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, she goes someplace. Little Red Riding Hood goes someplace, right? I mean, it doesn't happen at home. Hansel and Gretel find the witch, whatever it is. So anyway, go ahead, you take it, Logan. Let's get
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and the on the meta level, the things that they all have in common are that they are stories created by ourselves to cope with the real monsters that we encounter in our lives, or at least to take the fairy tale aspect of that, things that are too hard to talk about, especially to children. Things like virginity, sex, loss, grief, tragedy are wrapped in the wolf's clothing, or the clothing of a narrative that is more easy to understand. It's easy to understand, don't go near the wolf in the woods, than it is to say, watch out for sexual predators, if you want to read Little Red Riding Hood that way. But on the subject of, and real quick, just to get back to I know there will be another Frankenstein talk, but on the subject of making monsters, to me, it's a really beautiful example because of how the name Frankenstein has become associated with the monster instead of the doctor, the scientist who built the monster. It's another example of writing a monster who then from the audience gains its own life, is brought to life in a way that that has slipped away from the author's intentions. And I feel like that is true with a lot of what we're talking about, where the artist makes the monster, and then often the monster is no longer in control, or no longer under the control of the artist.
So just to be clear, you know, that the monster in that movie, so we call Frankenstein the monster traditionally, but that's actually the name of the doctor who makes the monster. It's
exactly.
strong. And so they've kind of come as one in one, as Iago and Othello do.
Exactly.
Okay.
That right. That is what I was trying to say. Perfect. So I made a monster after I started playing with this idea of adaptation of art from Theresia's class. When the initial assignment I had was, instead of writing a final paper, I could make a creative piece, and part of that was because I wrote a lot of papers for Theresia. I didn't get off the hook necessarily. This was just a kind of an additional one. And so I wrote this King Lear suite, which kind of vaguely adapted the story of King Lear and father-daughter relationships and death and grief. But also included in that themes from other Shakespeare plays, like Twelfth Night is in there, Cymbeline is in there, bits and pieces, again, spare parts from other works of art, in order to make this little 9-minute rock operetta. And I was struck by how much I learned about the original text by working it through the machine of creative processing and turning Shakespeare plays into music, and just translating, as Theresia said, from one medium of art to another. And discovering that it's not an exercise of just converting units of text to music, for example, but it's actually a kind of synthesis that happens where something new is born. By the way, there's a lot of language. We don't sadly have time to get too far into the birthing of monsters imagery that is all over Othello. But Iago's plot, he often describes it as bringing a monstrous birth to light. Side note. But the idea that adaptation can be a productive and a critical exercise more than just an artistic or a translational exercise kind of got to me. And then the word Theresia just mentioned is called ekphrasis, which is an art piece about an art piece, not necessarily a pure linear adaptation, but one that admits the parent work of art. The classic example is the Ode to a Grecian Urn poem, which is an ode, a poem to a Grecian urn, an urn. So it's one work of art about another work of art. And that was kind of the idea behind the play that I wrote, which is an adaptation of Othello. The quick pitch is that it all takes place in a recording studio, the tail end of the 60s, kind of the disenchantment of the hippie era, as it was turning all very sour from the peace and love thing. And Iago is a Charles Manson type recording engineer whose power is to seduce people with words. Othello is a rock guitarist, and Desdemona is a young white up-and-coming folk singer. And the premise is the same, but it is explored through music. So I think, are we at a point where I should maybe share a song or two? Okay.
Set a song up and tell us about it, and let's hear it.
Great. Okay. So just to close things out here, this is the first one. I think I'll play a song called "Watch the World Burn," and this is the only song in the show that is sung by the true monster of the text, Iago, and it includes lines from one of this really his most maniacal monologues that he delivers, or soliloquies that he delivers, about his kind of worldview about virtue being a fig, and our wills being everything, the authority of the will being all there is, which also should kind of ring a Hitler bell. So this is the Manson-esque psychedelic worldview of my Iago character in the adaptation of Othello, and hopefully this works. Here it goes. This is called Watch the World Burn.
Some of us have gone astray, scorned the straight and narrow way, or slowly lost the will to say it's still okay, it's still okay. Some of us still try to tame the terrors of the human brain, and all its power, and all its pain, and all its hate, and all its rage. Some will take the righteous path and wind up face down in the math. It goes to show some people never learn. Some of us will still deny the truth that lies before our eyes, and some of us just want to watch the world burn. Some of us just want to watch the world burn. Now in your soul a garden grows of all your lusts and little rows, and no one ever needs to know the things you need to see to yourself. Listen, wait the time, watch the fruit rot on the vine, poison ivy, dandelions, and thorny trees with 6-inch spines. Go and plant your virtues fair, God still won't exist or care. It goes to show some people never learn. But here's to all the toiling men who just can't seem to comprehend that some of us just want to watch the world burn. Some of us just want to watch the world burn. So as we hurtle through the air, just creep behind that curtain there and spin around the captain's chair. Oh, Jesus Christ, there's no one there. And all you see the whole way down are gaping pigs and circus clowns, market shares and baying hounds, and empty space and solid ground. From here turns the other cheek, the lion's himself from the rink. It goes to show some people never learn. Goodness never could outpace the cruelty of the human race, 'cause some of us just wanna watch the world burn. Some of us just wanna watch the world burn. Some of us just wanna watch the world burn. Some of us just wanna watch the world burn. Watch the world burn. Watch the world burn. Watch the
So this is kind of a musical response to a famous Coleridge quote about Iago's motives, where so much of criticism revolves around why Iago wants so badly to break up Othello and Desdemona, and Coleridge called it the motive, called that exercise of trying to figure out why, the motive hunting of motiveless malignity. So the song kind of represents the motiveless malignity of evil, or of racism, if that's not an anachronistic term in this context. All right, so maybe one more,
Yeah, do one more song and then we'll talk a little bit about the ending and then we'll stop, if that's okay.
Perfect. Great. Yep. So this song is about the concept of poison in the ear. Again, what we were talking about with the contagiousness and toxicity of language as it relates to the making of monsters and the spreading of evil. So this one is called Poison in the Ear. Again, it kind of cross-checks the concept with other Shakespeare plays. You'll hear references to Macbeth and Hamlet as well in this one. The first verse is about Michael Cassio, who gets drunk in Othello. The second verse is about Macbeth, who is poisoned by ambition via the language of the witches. And the third verse is about King Claudius and Hamlet, who was literally poisoned through the ear. So without further ado, this is Poison in the Ear. It's kind of a Hendrixy rock tune. You'll hear the voice of Desdemona on this too. Enjoy. Okay, classic 60s fade out. So that's Poison in the Ear. It comes at a plot point during which Cassio is kind of the first casualty of Iago's gossip. There's so much more to be said about monsters in Othello. We haven't even, I mean, one of the most famous lines is beware the green-eyed monster. Jealousy is described by Iago as a monster. It's also described by Emilia, Iago's wife, later on as the monster which mocks the meat it feeds on. There's a moment when Othello is trying to get Iago, well, Iago is pretending not to want to say or suggest to Othello that his wife is cheating on him. Othello pulls it out of him and forces him, well, it's all concocted by Iago, but eventually Othello demands to hear what is in Iago's mind, and before that he says it is as though in his mind is a monster too hideous to be shown, which of course is it hits at the literal definition of the monster, of something to be seen, related to the word demonstrate, and hideousness, which is all over Othello, and that which cannot be seen. And just to wrap up the end of Othello, at the end of a lot of Shakespearean tragedies, there's some semblance of, not redemption, but there at the end of Hamlet, right? Everybody dies. Okay, but Fortinbras comes in and says, now order will be restored to the kingdom. Kind of similar thing happens in King Lear. Similar thing happens in Macbeth. One of the great tragedies, the tragic conclusion happens, and then a lesser character comes on and says, now balance has been restored to the force. Okay, doesn't happen in Othello. The last words of Othello, the last thing that someone has to say about this whole tragedy, they come into the scene, they see what has happened. Othello has murdered Desdemona and then killed himself, and it says, let it be hid. Take it away. It is too hideous to be shown. So unlike a lot of the Shakespearean tragedies, there's nothing that can be said after the intimate violence that concludes Othello. It must be hid. It is tucked away. Iago kind of survives. We are promised by a side character that he will be tortured, that he has been captured and he will be tortured, but he doesn't get his comeuppance on stage the way other characters do. Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, we hear that he's going to be, I think, buried up to his neck and eaten by fire ants or something like that. But Iago, in some ways, survives the play. Stops talking. He says, "At this point, I will say no more." And it ends with Iago also being hid, being tucked away. So it's a dissatisfying resolution in a lot of ways, in that it is probably the most tragic on an intimate level of any of Shakespeare's plays.
And I would say to wrap that up with Beauty and the Beast a little bit again, which is when she looks in that mirror, she says, "I am the monster." And she says it to him too. I took myself away from you, and therefore, and then what he does at the end of that play is very different, and he inhabits the body, like through some kind of mystical way, but Diana shooting arrows and all kinds of crazy things, of what man she really wanted to look at. Because and Greta Garbo, a very famous actress long ago, said, I want my monster back. She thought that the monster was sexier and more attractive than this blonde white guy from some farmyard in Paris. And I would kind of agree, actually, because the monster's sort of cool and the other guy's kind of boring, but she gets both, and it's out of love that she gets him. And, I just wanted to, those of you who don't know who Charles Manson was, one thing to say about him, which is at work in the pernicious economic strains of Beauty and the Beast, but also then in Iago as terms of racism, which come capitalism, racism sort of together in this whole duality. What was I just about to say? That Charles Manson never killed anybody. He never hurt anybody. He had a bunch of girls around him, young women, who he got to literally murder Sharon Tate and take her newborn baby out of her tummy at 8 months old. Former wife of Roman Polanski, but at the time his wife. Tells you a few things there. And it was the great scandal of LA crime up until that point. I was in high school, I think, when this happened, or a little younger. And so just thinking about what it means to have someone else poison your ear, to do the dirty work for someone else, and maybe what we should all be claiming is that we are the monsters, that we should be looking in the mirror as to what monsters have we made. And that's sort of the message at the end of both of these things. One gets punished and one doesn't get punished. Maybe Iago stays alive, and that's the thing to worry about. The Beast in Beauty and the Beast gets transformed. Maybe that's the thing to worry about too. Anyway, we thank Logan Metz for being here. Truly a great pleasure. And we'll be around. He'll be around to answer questions for my class, and then I think Amy Ross will be there for the liberal studies class. Thanks to everyone, Emmy Lou Harris and Keith Jones, for helping us with the technical stuff. Okay, bye.
All right. So Tracy, thank you. That's so cool, that conversation. I loved hearing those songs, the songs with the lyrics. I think the first time I watched it through, the lyrics weren't up, and it just made me think of a lot of different things. So
for your class too, I don't know, Amy, this idea, you guys should because you're all teachers and going to be teachers, or maybe you're already teachers, but this idea of ekphrasis, which is, children who copy, children who tell the story again, children who make another story that's like Red Riding Hood. I mean, isn't that something teachers teach their students how to do, right? To write their own stories.
Yeah. And I think it's, it's a great example too. My students, I think like yours, have the option of their final project being a creative project or having a creative component. So it's really amazing to see what Logan did with the text, because this is definitely an option for them as well.
Good.
So do we just proceed by asking?
Yeah, do you have questions? We can't see you, so can you guys?
Yeah, so those of you who can, if you could let us see your faces if possible, that would be fantastic. And I'm going to put on my gallery view. So.
Oh yeah, where do I find gallery?
Yeah, it's up on the right hand side. Now I can see more folks. Hi everyone.
There you go. Hi.
Good to see. Just it's nice to see people's faces too, because we've been masked up. We've been in the classroom, so it's kind of great to see people's actual faces.
Do you recognize everybody?
I know. And Emily, I think gave me the ability to see, or she said she would text me if she sees hands up that I don't see. So I'll throw those in there if anybody has any initial comments that they want to throw out. I mean, I'd love to ask my students just any thoughts on the film versus the text of Beauty and the Beast, or anything that surprised you about reading the original version as opposed to, we talk a lot in our class about, Disney, right? And the difference between Disney and, and Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I found the inclusion of mythology to be really interesting with the statue of Diana that ends up, that is capable of turning the men into beasts, which obviously is part of the myth around Diana. So that really surprised me when that was sort of included towards the end.
Yeah,
it's another kind of adaptation, right? It's a myth that then gets in. Shakespeare used a lot of it himself, but just moving that over into that movie, then into the Beauty and the Beast story. It's a great point.
Yeah, and I think of Diana, and we just finished talking last week about having a very short unit on mythology, far too brief, but the way that the way that Diana, as the virgin goddess, right, her sort of famous scene where does she shoot Ecteon or slay her, put her dogs upon him, right? There's sort of, because he's being a beast, right, he gets destroyed by the beast. And yeah, I agree, Carrie. It looks like Emily, your hand is up.
Yeah, just a comparison between kind of the original version and the movie. There was this really interesting introduction in the movie where it was talking about how children just believe what you tell them, how it was almost like there was an intention of a more adult audience, because it was saying have that mindset now like a child would, instead of directing it directly to a child. And I thought that was really interesting, especially because the original version, the PDF version we read of Beauty and the Beast, was, I think, very intentionally meant for children. The messages, it was very pedagogical. You could tell she was trying to teach them something. And I think it was the way that was twisted, and that even just that opening was interesting to me.
Yeah, I very much agree. Tracy, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I also think, it reminds me of, how sometimes before a movie, they say this is not suitable for children. It's got the sort of opposite. It's like, oh my God, this is going to be really racy. And then you think, I better listen to it, or I better watch it because it draws you in. And I think this, I feel as an adult, this is sort of an insult to me. It's like, what do you mean? I have the imagination of a child, unfortunately. And so then you think, well, I'm going to learn. It's a way of the author and the filmmaker to draw you in, to say, can you imagine as well as a child can? Because I don't think the movie's meant for children. I don't. And I don't think a lot of fairy tales are meant for children, but they are, but they're about becoming adults in some ways,
Yeah, and you know, we haven't had a chance to talk as much about the origin of fairy tales, which we'll talk about a little bit more on Thursday. But they do, right, when they sort of arise, the literary fairy tale, right, as opposed to the wonder tale from earlier on, which is there right in the Middle Ages, right? I mean, these stories are sort of around, but you know, Emily, you're right. They weren't. It wasn't really. This one was written for children, but a lot of times, you know, and she was very nervous. I was thinking when Logan was talking about the writer as monster maker, that the authors of these early fairy tales, what's part of what's so interesting is so often they're women. I mean, we know a lot about like Perrault and the Grimm brothers who collected them, but a lot of the literary fairy tales came from women, and they were writing for these salons, and they and then when they turned them towards children, they wanted them to have sort of this didactic purpose, but there's also seems to be this unease, right? Like I think Emily, you were alluding to, right, that there's this like, well, you know, there needs to be a lesson here, right? And then in the text version, right, there's this very like, and they both prospered because they were both virtuous, you know, and it's like this very, very didactic, right? Kind of like this is the lesson that you need to take. But then we do see the story, I think, in the film, to me at least, like sort of outgrowing those bounds, you know, that it stretches far beyond that, and that I find that ending so fascinating, right? We just read a play, Teresa, where one actor plays multiple parts, right, in this play for children. And so we were talking about, if you guys remember from last week, we were talking about how the character who plays the cousin who beats up the main character, but also plays this other kid that he meets who ends up being his friend, right? So there's all this inversion via the actors of these characters, which reminded me a lot of the ending. And I don't know if anybody else wanted to talk about the transformation of Vante, right, into the beast, and then the beast into that actor. I thought that was so interesting.
Well, I think, you know, as we know, love is a transformative element. It's a drug that goes in your eye, you know, and it's a different kind of drug. Maybe it goes in your ear too, but you know, your beloved, when someone tells you you're beautiful or you're handsome or whatever it is they tell you, then it's a kind of madness, you know, and so she gets, it's sort of the wife of Bath's tale as a version of this too, right? Right, because he gets this crony old lover who really does care for him, and he can't sleep with her, and then she says, you want me to be beautiful, fine, but I'll be dishonest, basically, you know. And so and so I think that's that transformative, and that Amy, I think, raises a really good point. I think Logan did too, which is, how do you end something, right? And so we took this morning's class, we talked a little bit about the New Testament, and just, you know, you can go through the, you know, the stories of Jesus and the miracles and the this and the that, and how to live your life better and everything else. And then there's this thing you can't really leave out, which is the crucifixion. It would be a lot easier if you could leave out the crucifixion at some level, because it kind of is, I don't know if it's a happy story till that point, but it's certainly something quite different than when you've got somebody being tortured to death. Mm-hmm. Right. And the attendant versions of what that then it turns into. But that's it, just, you know, what do you end it with? And a lot of these people, like when they say things like, it's like that caveat that someone else brought up at the beginning, which is, and they were really virtuous people. Well, in the meantime, what were they doing in the cause of virtue? I mean, this is a woman sleeping with an animal. I mean, sorry, potentially. Right. I mean, this is way past cosplay. I mean, this is like, what is going on here? Right. And so there's that play that's like, oh yeah, and they were really virtuous. Well, yeah, good.
Which is there, right? In so many of the fairy tales, you know, there's one of my favorite versions of the Frog Prince, like one of the early versions. She's, you know, she's promised to marry this frog, right? It's kind of, right, it's one of the, you know, when you kiss the frog, it turns into a prince, the early version of that. And then she just really doesn't want to, you know, because he's a frog. And her father in one of the early versions is like, well, you promised, so now you have to take him into the bedroom, right? And he's a frog, right? He's like an amphibian. And she's like, it's you made your bed, you lie in it. And she picks him up and she smashes him against the wall. And when she does it, though, that's when he turns into the prince. So it's sort of this really interesting, like there's these moments too of like female aggression, right, and female autonomy in the fairy tales that I think are interesting, you know, which probably go to like who was writing them. But I was also thinking, Teresa, when you were saying about, right, the crucifixion and how you end things, if we think about Tolkien's view of the fairy tale, right, and Tolkien was you know, kind of a modern fairy tale writer and very interested in fairy tales. You know, he used this term eucatastrophe, right? That there's the catastrophe, and he says there's the catastrophe of the crucifixion, followed by the eucatastrophe, the drastic reversal of the resurrection, right? And his argument was that fairy tales imitate that in their structure, whereas other stories like fables, right, which we've talked about, right, sure, about, you know, like, you know, here's how to get by the powerful people, right? That other stories don't do that, but that we start to see this same structure in fairy tales, which is kind of this, yeah, it's the structure of the New Testament. But Erin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I had a question. Sorry if it's loud in my background. There's a load of laundry going. But I was wondering what you thought about like monsters and violence, and kind of how like young students are desensitized to all that, like through fairy tales, like in the Three Little Pigs, the wolf like eats the pigs and all that stuff. And I'm wondering like what message we send to like young students of like violence can be meaningful, especially like in comparison to like all the violent things that we see like in the US, like for example. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
I think it's a great point, and it's a very complicated point, because from the way I read the Little Pigs, at least, you know, build that brick house, you know, it's all about sort of, you know, get that straw and sticks out of my face, you know, build the brick house, which is a kind of almost a Protestant kind of, you know, idea of, you know, build a fortress, you know, get yourself away from all these other things. But you're right. And it's the problem of the monster, it seems to me, which is at once destructive and horrifying, racism being the one we tried to talk about, but also being seductive, right? Seductive in all kinds of ways. Like to be somebody else. And that doesn't mean you have to put on blackface, but it means that in some ways you know, Halloween's coming up. What are you going to be? Well, you're not, I'm sure Erin is not, you know, the witch she's going to be or whatever, right? But aren't you trying out an identity? And don't these stories in some ways, aren't they to be followed? And then you're right. I mean, does it teach you to be violent or does it not? I mean, I remember when my kid was little, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were out and they were forbidden in his school. And I remember going, stop it. This is like ridiculous. These are a bunch of turtles, you know, that are fighting the good fight, I thought, and I still think. And so the other problem is if children don't have an outlet to this, what do they do? And you know, since I do Shakespeare a lot, I mean, what happened after the Puritans took power in England was the first thing they did was close the theaters. And you think, oh, well, big deal. But just imagine everything you have that's visual, your internet, your this, your that, it's all shut out. All right. And the fantasies that go with that, some of them very dangerous, as we all know. And some of them, you know, shaming people and trolling people and God knows what else. But once they shut it down, people started killing people on stage, really killing them. They killed the king in Trafalgar Square. I mean, they commit regicide politically and publicly. And so if you don't have stories and if you don't have these things, where does that stuff go? And maybe a bigger question is, where does it come from in the first place? But, you know, that's a big question.
Yeah, and I would tie it back too, because Teresa, as you were saying, right, it's a complicated question, right? And we talk in children's literature, right? They talk a lot about mirrors and windows, right? Like so you know, the book can be right, nicely a mirror, right? It can, right, and it's important for children to have those, and it's important also for them to have, right, you know, the windows into other things. And some of you, when you did your field trip, right, out to see bookstores, right, and things like that, a lot of you asked in those first papers, like, but what's happening with fantasy? Like a lot of you expressed concern about this. Like, there's all these really, right, there's sort of a great amount right now of very realistic children's fiction, timely children's fiction, right, dealing with social issues in ways that I think people really appreciate. But there was this other question that recurred in a lot of your papers, like, what about fairy tales? What about fantasy? What's the purpose of those stories, and what does the violence do, right, in those, especially, right, and in the original ones, right, they are very violent, right? They're very, you know, people's feet get cut off, right? But even in the Disney ones, you there's fighting, right? People settle things through, sometimes they're fighting back, but they settle things through violence. And I think it's that question, Teresa, of sort of what's our relationship, to our fictions, right? And to our literature. Like, is it, does it necessarily mean that because we watch something, even as children, that we will imitate it, right? Or is there something deeper going on in that relationship, right? And Logan mentioned Bettelheimer. I think you mentioned Bettelheim, who wrote the kind of great scholar of fairy tales, who writes about how we children, he says, will be attracted to the fairy tale they need at a certain time. And he said it was really important not to clean it up for them, right? So that it's like he said, a lot of kids, when they're little, they love Hansel and Gretel, right? Why? Because they want to eat everything up. And they're also worried that they will get eaten up, right? And these lines aren't clear to them. And so when the witch gets pushed in the oven, it's really important that that happens. Like, sorry, which I think is kind of interesting. Right? It's important that the witch does not get befriended, right? Like that she does not get turned into something else. Which I think is, again, it kind of runs counter to some of how we look at literature for children more recently, but is a really interesting argument.
Well, it does take away the power of the monster if you show it in some ways. If you think of Jaws or you think of Alien or those kinds of movies, you can't see it, and I think it's absolutely right that it has to, I think Erin's point is right. It's like, is this encouraging violence or is it a valve?
Right.
And for me, it's a valve. Because I care about theater and films and things like that. And to me, it doesn't encourage me to go out and do something. It has quite the opposite effect. And it also allows for empathy. Like, you may never kill someone, you may never rape someone, you may never, this is Artaud's big line about all this stuff, but you can feel what it's like by watching it. Yeah. And that's a very slippery slope. But again, not to bring up the crucifixion one more time, but what are you looking at?
Yeah.
Right. One of the greatest acts of violence ever, certainly publicly revivicated over and over again. Kind of irony to say that, but so is it a way to think of something as release, or is it a way to think of something that is only encouraging? And I don't think any of us want to be crucified, frankly, but we use that language.
Mm-hmm.
And people are martyrs, or people will give their lives for causes. Maybe they're inspired by religion.
Yeah.
There's stories too.
I saw Alexa and then Erin.
I was just thinking about like the adaptations of a lot of these fairy tales by Disney, and how, I guess, reductive they almost are to really, it's a love story. Like, that's the biggest part that sticks out to me, is that love story aspect of all the fairy tales. And along that same kind of vein is that they're mostly aimed towards girls, and that ultimate goal and the ultimate memory that sticks out from these, like, we look up to princesses. Like, when you go to Disneyland, you get called like a princess, and that's like the best thing ever. But the stories that are depicted through Disney, the biggest thing is they get married or they fall in love. And that's not the case in all of them. And more recently, we've seen depictions where, like with Merida and with Elsa, that's not relevant to the story. But those early, the early visions that I saw of the fairy tales revolved around that love aspect, and it's interesting to see like what lesson that teaches to, like, especially girls, about what they should be doing versus like how original fairy tales, like the lessons they taught outside of that love story aspect.
And Alexa, I'm so much older than you are, so for me, early Disney is actually quite disturbing stuff. If you have ever seen Dumbo or Snow White or the original Sleeping Beauty or Fantasia, even though it's kind of a weird movie, to me, they're about the killing of the mother. What is Pinocchio about? He wants to be a real boy. He has no mother, and he has this adopted father who made him out of a puppet. It's a Frankenstein story in some ways. And so it's interesting what happened to Disney, because I think it really did go to a female audience, and one that's very dangerous, mostly, I think, from what I've seen. There's some exceptions, but it is, if you get married to your prince, you're going to be okay. But remember what's lurking behind that in Sleeping Beauty and the original Snow White, which is a lot of scary stuff. And that's what most kids of my generation remember. Being chased through the forest, being poisoned, being attacked by animals, having your mother die, being humiliated for having big ears, you know, and that sort of stuff. So it's interesting what happens when market forces get involved as well. And those movies were very profitable, I think. Jose, you probably know more about that than I do, but they were well attended movies, were they not, the early ones?
Sorry. Hello, everyone. Just very rapidly. Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your appetite towards Disney-esque mythology, he became the modern folktale or redefine the folktale tradition, because I rather call it, instead of fairy tales, folk tales, because not all fairy tales have fairies and the degree of fantasy. And also one other point, since we have touched Bethlehem, is that the folk tale or the fairy tale is not necessarily created within the structure of creating a morality, right? It's not a moral tale per se. So it's basically what Bethlehem is saying is it's universal dreams, universal archetypes, universal settings of the human condition that a kid actually finds interesting, because there's like this constant transformation of energies. So there's like this, Bethlehem even talks about like this idea of the duality of energies, in which grandma and the wolf are exactly the same entity, right? So how is it that a youngster deals with the violence or stages of violence or anger or whatever you want to call it of an adult in the way that they are relating to that child, and how that child cannot destroy the figure of a parent, but actually reassociate it with another archetype figure and then still be able to love his parent or her parent, etc. Right? So I think that if we, I think it's the wrong question to ask fairy tales or folk tales not to contain the element of violence, because violence is not necessarily physical. It can be performed in many ways. And what Bethlehem insists is that if we detach in the way that Disney did by watering down a classical European folktale from the 19th century that was the source of inspiration for all of the Disney universe, then what we are doing is exactly what Theresia had said in a couple of occasions, is like getting rid of the crucifixion in the Passion of the Christ, right?
And I think, yeah, I mean, this is my opinion, you don't have to share it, but I've had one child, and I can tell you, being around a lot of little kids, they don't need to learn violence. I mean, you know, you have a little brother and you just every now and then want to pop him one, and that happens. And that doesn't mean, I watched parents who were raising their kids without any of this stuff around them, right? And you know, they just get sick of it after a while. And so what part of that is, you know, these secrets? What's the greatest fear a child has? You'll lose your mother. Then you lose your father. Well, a lot of these stories are about losing your mother or your father, or, you know, the great fears. And I think that, you know, as Jose said more eloquently, that they're a sort of, you know, a valve in ways, that they're a way of understanding what goes on in these fairy tales or folk tales. And he's right, they're folk tales, it's not fairies in everybody. And they're not really magical either, some of them. But is the wolf really another part of Little Red Riding Hood? Right? Is that what she wants to be? You know, and I think the Halloween theme really does go there. Why are you dressing up like a witch? Because you're probably all very nice people. You're not witches, but maybe some of you ladies want to be just for one day. You know, wouldn't it be nice? You didn't have to smile and be pleasant to everybody, right? So the costume is to, you know, re-invoke the identity that we don't have, or to experiment with it, which sometimes goes too far. Someone else had their hand.
Yeah, I see some people put their hands down, but Serapha, you still had your hand up.
Something I was gonna say that stuck out to me in the older version of Beauty and the Beast was like the emotional manipulation that happened, like kind of connecting to what Jose was saying as like a different type of violence. And like the way that the beast is saying, I'll die if you're not there, or like how his sisters or her sisters were saying, I'll die if you're not there. Like that was really jarring to me. It was like, oh, if especially for the sisters' sides who obviously didn't like her, but I mean them trying to evoke the like guilt of like, oh, her not being there as the maternal figure for them anymore, like then they like won't be able to survive without her. Like I felt like that was very jarring, especially if it's like the way that Disney adapted it, like it wasn't that aggressive, but like the fact that it's still like a princess story, and like if kids were to see this, like kids in the like back then, they probably would have, especially girls, would have felt that they were supposed to stay with whoever like needed them most, kind of.
Yeah, and there's a real pull for her to stay with her father, right? I mean, the sisters are nasty pieces of work, and that's all Cinderella. It's all in Cinderella to begin with, and there's many versions of Cinderella all through time. But I mean, all the way back. But you know, these evil two sisters, and then the good sister, and the good sister does all the work, but who's actually really beautiful and gets the prince. You know, and that has its own problems with it. But I think when the beast says, "I die without you," it's not a metaphor. He's literally going to die. And that is really interesting to me, because wouldn't we all die if we weren't loved? Right? I mean, they're not talking about that they love her. They want her to stick around and maybe give him some fancy dresses and clean the house. He really loves her. And so that metaphor that, you know, you'd say to your lover, I die for you. Well, hopefully you don't have to do that, but that's what you say, right? And what do you mean by that? You would cease to feel a human if it wasn't for their love.
Which I think it's interesting to the different reasons why the beast is the beast, right? And even in the text that we looked at, right? So that he's in the de Beaumont, right? He's sort of like, well, I just had this spell put on me and nobody could really see how good I was, right? And it's sort of this story about recognizing beauty beneath the surface. And then in the movie, he seems to say something like, my parents didn't believe in enchantment, so then I was enchanted. And then in the Disney version, he actually brings it upon himself, right? He's really mean to this old lady. It's a little bit like out of Chaucer. And because of that, right, she's like, well, now I'm going to turn you into a monster until you can receive love. So it's more of a punishment. But in each of them, it seems like he has to be redeemed, right, beyond his appearance, right? He needs, right, he's in the beast is never really the beast inside, whereas the male character, right, if it's either Gaston, right, or Gaston in the Disney version, right, or Avanti in this one, I don't know, the Disney kind of plays it out so that like the real handsome man is actually the monster. Right. And there's like this, right, in the Cocteau version, what I think is so interesting is, right, the beast asks her, right, after he's been transformed, did you love him? And she says yes. Right. So see, that seemed very layered and complicated to me.
Yeah, and like, who's she in love with? I mean, it's like the
Right.
the wife of Bastiel. Is she in love with? So if the inside's the beast, which is good and kind and magical and rich and, you know, name it, right, and sexually virile, it seems, and then the outside is this guy in tights who looks kind of strange to me. I mean, you know, like he's just sort of silly, but it's the same actor, by the way, which is also very interesting. And so what is it that, you know, again, what is it women really want? You know, do you want the guy in the tights that's going to fly around with you, or do you want the beast? And then in her case, she kind of gets both.
Yeah.
In a weird way. She gets the outside, but the inside, I hope. But, you know, who knows? But see, I don't think this thing ends all that clearly, the movie at least.
No, I thought it was very interesting in its ambiguity, you know, and then in the original text too, there's a big deal being made about like how she gets a library, which is the same thing in the Disney version. There's a big thing, right? He gives her the library so she can read. She's a big reader, so there's this connection with her literacy. And it doesn't seem to matter as much, right, that he becomes handsome, because she sort of has rejected that as something important, right, in a suitor. Whereas here, again, yeah, she gets both, right? Like she kind of dug the handsome guy who was her brother's friend. You know.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting.
Anybody else? Well, I want to thank Jose Garcia Moreno for coming twice to this today. You're glutton for punishment, either that or, God. But he's together. We sort of helped put this together, and it's been such a pleasure to work with him and with ACTI, which is the wonderful sort of, I think of it as the other organization that sort of does what the Marymount Institute does. So, but a little differently, but it's been great fun. And thank you for showing up and giving us so much support. So anyway, thank you all, huh? We're good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks to my class. I'll see you on Thursday, and we'll pick up a lot of these threads, your readings on Bright Space, and just have a good day, and I'll see you then.